God healed Naaman of leprosy through Elisha. And then chapter 6, we see the axe head that it was made to float. And then if you remember the chariots of fire as they came and to slay Elisha. But we're going to be over in chapter 6, verse 24. And we're going to try and cover a lot of ground and really talk about God's truth in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 24. And let's start off there in verse 24. Verse 24 and 25 says, "Afterward, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver." Now, let's stop right there for a second. Mitchell, I was just telling them that I did check with the Sunday school teachers this time to make sure we didn't have any overachievers that got through all the scriptures. But here's the thing. I want to stop right there and just talk about the setting right quick. Because in the setting, okay, we see somebody that's been in the story before. Ben-Hadad, he's the king of Syria. And Syria was to the north of Israel, okay, and that was, you read a lot of the chapters here, and what you constantly find is Ben-Hadad and Syria and Israel, they're constantly fighting. Okay, and so like in 1 Kings chapter 20, he's there laying siege to Samaria. God delivers his people. And then in the next chapter, here you see it again, where he is attacking them again. And in chapter 6, you see that like in verse 8 of chapter 6, the king of Syria was warring against who? Israel. And so that's when they went to try and find Elisha, and the chariots of fire showed up, and they went home, or Elisha led them in the town, and then they went home. Well, guess what they're doing again in verse 24? Attacking the people of Israel. And so they're doing that. Now, there's a few things that are important for us to note, okay? Because in verse 24, we see it's the king, but this time, who all did he bring to the fight? Okay, how much of his army? Yeah, everybody. The entire army. He said, man, we're not leaving anybody at home. We are calling up everybody, calling up the reserves, and they besieged Samaria. Samaria was the capital city of Israel, and this tells us about the battle because it was not a battle out on an open battlefield, but it was a siege where basically the people were in the city, the army was outside the city, and the army outside is going to starve them out, is how this would work as a siege. Now, also, though, in verse 25, there's an important detail, because what's the weather been like? Yeah, famine. Hadn't rained. Man, it's bad. But we not only find out about the climate, but we also see about just the situation, the insane inflation that was going. Now, in verse 25, it mentions that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. Now, things had gotten so bad at this point that people were down to eating things that normally you would think would be unedible, right? And that a donkey, just the head of a donkey, was 80 shekels of silver. Now, there's kind of a basis in Solomon's reign. Scripture tells us that a live horse would be 150 shekels, okay? And so, man, this donkey's head is, man, an astronomical amount, just for people who can stay alive. And then it also mentions, some dove dung there for 5 shekels of silver. Now, a shekel was generally what a person would make in a month, is how bad things are. And commentators, when they talk about this little bit of a dove's dung, they say, hey, it's either probably just like pigeon poop, dove dung, or maybe there was some sort of little like root or thing that was like a little pea type, not vegetables the right word, but something that people would eat if things got really hard. Either way, things are bad in that setting. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, let's look in 26 through 30. Somebody want to start us off there? We're going to read 26 through 30.
This woman said to me, "Give me your son that we may eat him we boiled my son and ate him. And on the next day I said to her, give your son that we may eat him. But she had hidden her son. When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath on his body.
All right, so let's look at this, how bad things have gotten. I mean, isn't that sick? How the king, here he is, he's out walking by on the wall. You know, we don't know if he's checking things out. Maybe he's just looking at the enemy army, checking people out in the city. But this lady sees him and gets his attention. And it's interesting because in verse 27, who does he say is not helping? Okay, the Lord. Did you pick that up? You know, in the king's mind, whose fault is the famine? Whose fault is the enemy surrounding them? Who would he say? Yeah, the Lord. Jeroboam is not Jeroboam. Jehoram is the king. So he was one of Ahab's sons. Not a good king. Israel didn't have any good kings that said they did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But here he is, the king. He's there, and so he makes the comment in verse 27. Look, God's not going to help you. How can I? The threshing floor is where you thresh your wheat. Well, there hadn't been any wheat because there's famine. Okay, the wine press is where you would press out your grapes, so you would have things to drink. Have your wine to drink and your juice to drink, man, for the rest of the year. Okay, and it's like that's all used up, that's all gone. That's not going to be helpful. And so he does ask her, "What's your trouble?" And then she tells us of just this this cannibalistic agreement that her and this other lady had. That the lady said, "Hey, you got a son, I got a son. Let's cook yours and eat him today, and we'll do mine tomorrow." Now, the lady was upset, not that her son was gone, but why? That's right. The other lady was holding back. And, this lady, she said, I did my part. I gave my kid. But this other lady, she's a liar. She's hiding her kid. And I mean, just here's the thing, though. First, to draw away from this, is that things were so bad in Samaria in this siege that I want you to understand that what is going on was not unheard of when you read through history when an enemy army would lay siege to a city, is that people would resort to cannibalism after everything was already eaten. Okay? And they are at that point. Man, they are at the very bottom of the barrel. The people of Israel are. The king hears this in verse 30. Now, he has a reaction that's just, good, that he's distraught. And he sees this, and people notice this in verse 30. But let's keep going, okay? In verse 32, we're going to read down through chapter 7, verse 2, okay? It says, or verse 31 down through 7:2. And I'll start as it says, "And he said, May God do so to me, and more also, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Now the king had dispatched a man from his presence, but before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Do you see how this murderer has sent to take off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" And while he was still speaking with them, the messenger came down to him and said, "This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for my Lord any longer?" Okay, somebody want to read verse 1 and 2 of chapter 7? All right, isn't it interesting? So the king, back up there in verse 31, that, his response to all this trouble is, we got to deal with the problem. Who's the problem, does he say? Elisha. So he decides that he's going to just say, man, his head can no longer stay on his shoulders. Today, it's got to come off. I mean, he was intent with that. And, so the scene shifts in verse 32 where Elisha is there. So apparently Elisha is in with the city, a part of the siege. Okay, he's there in amongst his countrymen. I mean, he was not immune to the troubles. God is providing for him, though. And so he tells the guys who were with him, he says, look, the king's sending somebody. He's an assassin. He's coming to, to put some separation between my head and my shoulders. And so verse 33, while Elisha's saying this, somebody knocks on the door. I don't know if they knocked back then. I doubt they had the doorbell. But, they did that. And it's interesting because in verse 33, this messenger from the king, what's his response? Or what's his statement? Yeah, whose fault is all this? He says, God's. It's the Lord's fault. It's the Lord's fault that there's nothing to eat. It's the Lord's fault that there's no protection. It's the Lord's fault that we can't travel. It's the Lord's fault that it hadn't rained. It's the Lord's fault that people are eating each other. And it's the Lord's fault that the king doesn't know what to do. It's God's fault. And so he says, look, we're done waiting on the Lord. Now I want you to notice in verse 33, how is Lord spelled? Okay, all caps. So remember in your Bibles when you see that, it is speaking of Yahweh. That's because in the Hebrew it's Yahweh, the sacred name of God. And so this messenger is, he is being very clear that he holds God at fault for all that's going on. Now, it's interesting because Elisha, though, has a word from the Lord that God is speaking through Elisha, and he says, look, tomorrow things are going to be different. And here's what Elisha is saying. Look in verse 1. He says, about this time, so tomorrow, he says, flour and barley. Now think about flour and barley. That's what you need to bake bread. There's probably little to none of that left in Samaria, right? People are eating each other, so we're assuming that there's very little that's there. And if there is some left, somebody's either really good at hiding or they had a really big sword. Okay? And so he says, look, tomorrow, man, just the barley and the flour, these things that you need, that they're going to be sold at just an ordinary price, not just this extreme, skyrocketed inflation price of war. But he says it's just going to be normal prices. Now, the captain in verse 2 who heard this said, look, if the Lord made the windows in heaven, could this thing be? He's like, man, God would have to do a miracle for this to happen. Now, it's funny because just before this, he was blaming all the problem on who? God. I think there's some sarcasm in there, no doubt. But notice Elisha says to him at the end of verse 2, he's like, you're going to see it, Captain. You're going to see it, but you're not going to eat of it. Okay, God's going to fulfill his word, but you're not going to partake in that. All right? And so, man, it's a terrible situation, isn't it? Now, let me ask you about this. Was Elisha, the man of God, immune from the troubles of the ungodly people around him? Okay, why do y'all say that?
He lived among them, and he was part of
Yeah.
the culture that was going on.
Right. He's in there too. And earlier in this chapter, you see that there wasn't just a price out for his life from the king of Israel, but the king of Syria was not a fan of Elisha either. He wanted him dead. But he's being faithful to where God has placed him. Now, let's keep going, okay? Because we're going to see God's, how God gives protection and provision. So let's look in verse 3 through 5. Somebody want to read 3 through 5?
There were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate, and they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there.
All right, so here these lepers are who were outside the city of Samaria, and man, things for them are especially dire. I mean, it's interesting. The people won't even let them in, and so they, in their conversation, they're like, hey, look, we're going to die anyways. If we go to the city, we're going to die. Now, they probably would have been kicked out of the city, but they said, look, let's try this. Verse 4, let's go over to the camp of the Syrians. Maybe All right, so man, the Lord is responsible for this. Verse 6 is really responsible, is real clear on this. Now, the ungodly king of Israel is blaming God for all the what? Trouble, all the bad things. Why would God let this happen? But here we see that the Lord is protecting his people because, man, he made it where the Syrian army, okay, that they heard the sound of a great army, and so they said, man, the Israelites, they sent for help. Somebody got out and went and got help, that the Hittites and the Egyptians have come against us. And so they left in a heartbeat. They just left with what they had and just took off. It's interesting that they didn't even take their horses or their donkeys. They just left and fled for their lives. Now, one of the things that I wonder about is, I think of earlier in chapter 6, starting in there in verse 8, is when the king of Syria sent some of his military guys to go try and knock off Elisha. Did any of y'all get to that in Sunday school? Okay, Mitchell's class. I didn't either, Mitchell. So you may be familiar with that story. But I've just wondered, word travels fast, even in a time without the technology we have. It's just that what happened there, where the people saw those chariots of fire and how God protected them, if there was already just among the army this idea that, man, we better watch out. This is a dangerous thing that we're doing. I don't know. But what we do know is that the Lord put fear in them, that they heard chariots and horses, and so they skedaddled in a hurry. God's powerful protection. God's powerful protection. Now, God could have delivered them in countless other ways, right? He could have sent an angel and to slay thousands of them. He could have, done a number of things. But in this instance, man, not only did he make the enemy army to flee away, but he also caused them to do it in such a way where they left all their stuff, right? Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, let's read verse 8 through 15, and I'll start as it says. And when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent and ate and drank. And they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off the things from it and went and hid them. Isn't that funny? Just you read it, you're like, oh, that's just probably what the rest of us would do. Get something to eat first. And they're like, hey, what's, they're like, we're going to go put this stuff up. We're going to store it for them. And so now verse 9, it says, then they said to one another, we are not doing right. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now, therefore, come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they came and called the gatekeepers of the city and told them, we came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no one to be seen or heard there, nothing but the horses tied and the donkeys tied in the tents as they were. Okay, verse 11. So they took 2 horsemen. Now it's interesting because in 13 they're like, let's send 5. And the king's like, no, we can't spare 5. So he sends 2. Verse 14, so they took 2 horsemen, and the king sent them after the army of the Syrians, saying, go and see. So they went after them as far as the Jordan, and behold, all the way was littered with garments and equipment that the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. So wow, it was true. Man, the Syrians had left. The camp was empty, and not just that it was empty, it was filled with all their stuff. And the evidence of them fleeing, getting out of Dodge in a hurry, was scattered out all along the way that they went. I mean, what a miracle it was. What a grace and mercy of God to save and deliver his people. Okay, let's keep going because we need to hustle up on this. Verse 16 says, Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. And the people trampled him in the gate so that he died. And the man of God had said, when the king came down to him, for when the man of God had said to the king, 2 seahs of barley shall be sold for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel, about this time tomorrow in the gate of Samaria. Verse 19, the captain had answered the man of God, If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could such a thing be? And he had said, You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died. Now, just an amazing story of God's protection, but also his provision. But there's another thing I want to add to this, is that what is happening was not a surprise, okay? Because just as God said in Scripture, in the law, in Deuteronomy, is that, man, when the people would turn away from God, it was going to bring curses. Okay, and one of the things, like in Deuteronomy 28:53, mentioned just ungodly things, even where people would be, I believe, like eating one another. Okay, cannibalism. Things would get so desperate and so bad, and so they did that. But also something that is interesting. Okay, turn over to 1 Kings chapter 20. Okay, 1 Kings chapter 20. Okay, so 1 Kings chapter 20, this is when Ahab is king, okay, when the area we just read, his son was king. But in 1 Kings chapter 20, okay, look over in verse 42. 1 Kings chapter 20, verse 42. This is at the very end of a story where God helps Ahab defeat Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, and Ahab was supposed to kill him, but he didn't. He said, You get to go back home. So look in verse 42, this is a prophet who comes and speaks to him. He says, Then he said to him, Thus says the Lord, because you have let go out of your hands the man whom I have devoted to destruction. Therefore your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people. And the king of Israel went to his house, vexed and sullen, and came to Samaria. And I know we're just catching a snippet of that story, but here's the thing, is that Ahab was supposed to kill the king of Syria, and he didn't. Okay? The king of Syria had attacked him. In chapter 20, 2 different episodes of them attacking him, and Ahab thought, Hey, I'm going to do such and such. I'm going to make a covenant with him, and he's going to stick to his covenant. Look in chapter 20, like verse 34. Hey, and Ben-Hadad said to him, The cities that my father took from your father I will restore, and you may establish bazaars for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. And Ahab said, I will let you go on these terms. So he made a covenant with him and let him go. Ben-Hadad, King Ben-Hadad, although you've attacked me 2 different times just here recently, I'm going to let you go. Surely you're going to keep your word, right? Surely not, as you read, because time and time again, man, it is attacking us. And it's a reminder of just the how disobedience has consequences with that. Now, with Ahab, we see, disobedience on countless levels with it. But it's interesting because, man, the pain and the suffering that the people endured could have been avoided. Should have been avoided. But it wasn't, because, man, their leader didn't do what was right, didn't do what was expected as a king, but also what he was supposed to do before the Lord. And so, man, the consequences were grave. The consequences were very serious. But, man, through this, think about God's mercy and his grace to rescue them and protect them in such a miraculous way and provide for them when they were starving to death, and provided for them abundantly when the Syrian army, man, left in such haste. Let me ask y'all, what other things stick out to you, or maybe something came to mind with that?
Comes to my mind is the fact that everything's good. I don't need God, and it's all me. But when things go bad, it's God.
Yeah.
They always
Yep.
do that. And, Baal worship was big at the time. Maybe not right here, maybe. But they sure didn't blame Baal.
That's right.
Verse 23, the end of there, and the Syrians
Yeah, yeah,
Right, the next sentence.
Yeah.
Don't do that again. Yeah, they did.
yeah, yeah. Sounds like, I don't know, Russia. Just, or, yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, it was. Yeah, and that's so true because it's like Elijah stood for the Lord, and man, and us in the same way we stand on God's truth, and people don't like that because there are